Hello guys, this is Mr. Southall. I'm going to be recording some information, some instruction for you for the week of April 20th of 2020. This will help to kind of correspond and go along with your notes at home. What we're going to do is kind of do some units that progress towards the end of the year. We thought we were just about to wrap up this unit with Vietnam and the 1960s, so we're going to basically go back to that and do a DBQ essay tied into the Vietnam, since you're all very familiar with that, and see how you do on this essay. That'll kind of inform our opinion about how to make the next three assignments. But just be aware, this is the video recording for instruction for all U.S. history teachers, Mr. Delatte, Mr. Munsell, and myself. So I'm just going to kind of give you a quick refresher, quick reminder of the Vietnam War back in the 1960s. Okay, so first of all, you have the United States enters the war with the Tonkin Gulf Resolution in '64 under Johnson. It was a result of an attack by some North Vietnam boats in the Gulf of Tonkin near Vietnam. It pulled us in. Well, we didn't find out too much later on that a lot of the information surrounding the attack was initially a lie, but it was enough justification to finally get us involved in the Vietnam War. So by 1965, we're doing Operation Rolling Thunder. We're doing bombing attacks onto North Vietnam. We're also doing our first combat troops on the ground by the spring and summertime of 1965. Under Johnson in the 1960s, from 1964 until 1969, essentially it's constant escalation. Troops are constantly increasing more and more and more, which means we don't have enough volunteers back home to get soldiers into Vietnam. So as a result, we had to have a draft back home. More on that in a minute. So troop builds up excessively. We're going to go from about 15, 20,000 combat soldiers in 1965 when it first starts to about over 500,000 by 1968 and 1969 under Johnson. So I'm not going to go through a lot of the combat because the assignment itself does not involve a lot of the combat, but we know the combat was very frustrating for a lot of these soldiers. These soldiers go over there. A lot of them don't want to be there because they're drafted. They don't really know what they're fighting for. They're fighting a civil war within a civil war. If you recall, there's fighting within South Vietnam, as well as North Vietnam forces coming in through across the borders, across the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There's a lot of support coming in from China and from the Soviet Union as well. And all these, it's very difficult to basically maintain the South Vietnam borders, especially whenever you're protecting a government in the South that's not very well liked by its own people. So it's kind of like, what are you there fighting for? You would go and take a position and immediately get overtaken back by the Viet Cong or the Viet Minh soldiers. And it was just overall very, very frustrating, which lowered a lot of morale for a lot of these soldiers. And so a lot of these soldiers ended up, doing drugs, getting involved with a lot of alcohol, could become alcoholics, whatever it took to cope with the situation. So just overall, Vietnam War was very frustrating. But what you need to kind of be aware of is that in the 60s, the war kept escalating. The war kept bringing in more and more soldiers, which caused a draft to go on back home. But the war itself was very frustrating how we were fighting. We couldn't really see into the war in sight. We didn't know how to win. We couldn't take over the territories we wanted to take over. The whole thing was very frustrating. Now, these are the parts you want to be more aware of for the assignment. Kind of the reaction to the war back at home in general. So back home, you have these student groups or a lot of college-age kids who are already not wanting to, they don't want to join the war if they can avoid it. And the draft does come out in the 1960s under Johnson to help fulfill the need for Vietnam. One of the ways to get out of the draft was, of course, you could go to college, and so that means that mostly middle class or upper middle class and even rich people could avoid going to Vietnam if they were able to get to go to college. And so that meant this was a working class war. A lot of people who were more in poverty were much more likely to get drafted. And they weren't even always aware of all the ways they can get out of being drafted. So a lot of these lower income people who were more in poverty a lot of times got unfairly drafted into the war a lot more than they should have been drafted. African Americans, there was a much larger group of African Americans that should have fought. 10% of the U.S. population was African American male, and 20% of the U.S. Army was African American males, because a lot of those guys could not get out of poverty. They were living in poverty back home, thus they were much higher targets for being drafted. And for women in general, women were not drafted at the time, but they were serving in like nursing roles in other areas too. You have the credibility gap developing back home too. As a reminder, the presidents, the generals like President Johnson, General William Westmoreland, and others kept saying the war's getting closer to being over. We're winning, which was true in the sense of how battles went. A lot of times we would kill more of them in these battles than they kill of us, but we can never seem to quite get them to stop coming. So the people on TV, the generals and the politicians, kept telling us we're winning. But the media was in this war, this being the first televised war, the first living room war. The media was there constantly watching all this happen and showing video footage of body bags coming back home, actual combat situations, and it seemed to be that what they were telling us versus what was actually happening was not actually true. So there's a credibility gap growing every year the war goes on, that people begin to trust the government and the war less and less. The most common people to protest this war would, of course, be young people who are college age or out of high school, because they're the ones most likely to be drafted. So you have groups that develop, like SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society and the Free Speech Movement, that start off by protesting college issues, but then grow into criticizing the Vietnam War. So college campuses like University of California at Berkeley and places like in Michigan become hotbeds for protests of the Vietnam War. So every year the war goes on, protests get stronger and stronger. There'll be protests in Washington, D.C. There'll be protests on major university campuses. Some campuses will even shut down because of these protests. And so there's a divide growing between our country in terms of age roles. A lot of younger people from like teenagers to about 30 were very anti-war, didn't see the reason for the war. And a lot of older people, usually 30 and older, felt like these kids were just being whiny and bratty, that basically they had fought in Korea or World War II, their fathers had fought in World War I, it was just their turn to go, and they felt like this was very unfair, and they were just not wanting to go do their country's service. So there's a big growing gap between the people in America, which leads to doves and hawks. You have people who are for the war, which are hawks, people who are against the war, which are doves. Younger people, typically, especially college-age kids, were the ones who are more or less the doves a lot of times. You do see a lot of draft protesting. People would avoid the draft if they could. In fact, a lot of our presidents found ways to avoid the draft, like Bill Clinton fled to Canada. George W. Bush, he went to the National Guard to avoid going into the war. And, of course, Donald Trump got medical waivers to get out of the war, too. But a lot of people did those kind of things to avoid going into the war, finding medical excuses or fleeing the country or whatever it took to get out of serving in the Vietnam War. But overall, most Americans supported the war until 1968. In 1968, you had the big turning point battle, the Tet Offensive. It was a big surprise attack that ended up attacking multiple locations in South Vietnam where the U.S. Army was. Now, when this happened, it took about a month to do so, but we regained back all the territory we lost, and we actually killed way more of them than they killed of us in the Tet Offensive. However, because even though we won from a military standpoint or tactical standpoint, a lot of the public perception back home, especially from the media, guys like Walter Cronkite and news anchors, began to turn the war. They said, there's no way this war is ever going to be won. We've been told for now 3 or 4 years, the war's almost over, the light's at the end of the tunnel, we're going to win this thing, and here we are, we had this big surprise attack that no one really saw coming, and now we just know the war is terrible, we got to get out of it. So Johnson began to run his campaign for re-election that year after Tet. He didn't have a very strong showing. People from his own party began to challenge him, like Eugene McCarthy. McCarthy was saying he would have the Democratic Party take America out of the war. And so when Johnson saw that he wasn't doing so hot, he pulled out the election in March of 1968 and let the election be taken up by other people in his own party. So McCarthy still ran, but he wasn't well liked, and he was also not well supported, even though he was an anti-war Democrat. Robert Kennedy becomes a front runner, but he gets assassinated later that year. And of course, the Democrats eventually settle on the vice president, Hubert Humphrey. And there was a lot of fighting over this in the actual national convention, actual fist fighting, as well as a lot of people who were protesting outside the convention in August of '68 because the Democrats were the one who started this war, and they thought they were lying to them and telling a lot of lies about this war, and it was a lot worse than they were making it out to be. So the person who eventually ends up winning is the former vice president to Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, who comes back and runs as a Republican and ends up winning the war. Now, that's about where we stopped during this in class back in March. I just want to kind of scroll down. We didn't really cover all this before, but understand back home you have other movements that are taking place too, countercultural movements, um, women's rights movements, Latino movements. So just like civil rights are happening in the 1960s with like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, you have women's rights, people who are protesting, for civil rights as well. Women want to be treated with more equality, be paid better. Native Americans as well as Latino Americans are also fighting for their rights too. People like Cesar Chavez and the American Indian movement. So those are movements that are happening simultaneously with Vietnam. One of the biggest tie-ins to the Vietnam War is the counterculture movement. That there's a lot of hippies. Obviously, a lot of people who are protesting also would dress differently. They would let their hair grow long. They would dress in colorful clothing. They would not, behave the same way their parents did. And they challenged their parents in the adult culture as much as possible. So hippie culture, or what's called a counterculture movement, these younger people who challenge the norms of society, corresponded with Vietnam. A lot of people who were hippies were also people who were doves and protested the war and also avoided the draft and didn't want to be drafted in this war they thought was unjust. So all these things kind of corresponded at the same time at home, along with civil rights, women's rights, and other movements too. So that's not really in-depth look, but that should give you some good contextualization for this assignment. If you have any other questions and need help, please feel free to email your teachers, Mr. Munsell, Mr. Delatte, or myself. And I hope you all have a good quarantine. Good luck on the assignment. Thank you, guys.